All right, so in this video, what I want to do is give a brief high-level overview of what bilingualism is, looking both at bilingual individuals and, of course, bilingual communities, because bilingualism inherently exists within communities rather than individuals, although we often think of it that way in the United States. And I'm doing this as a preview to the next video, which is going to be about bilingual education, but it's worth understanding what bilingualism is. Both in the human brain as individuals and then how it functions within communities before we move on to that. So looking at the very broad context for bi or multilingualism, I want you to think to yourself about how many languages might be spoken in the world today. If you don't know that already, go ahead and kind of make a guess for yourself, see if you have some sense of how many it might be. And when you have that number in your head, I'll tell you that the answer is about 3,000, depending on how you count the distinctions between languages and dialects, things like that. Now ask yourself, how many nations, recognized nations, do you think there are in the world today? And this is another question without a completely firm answer, although the UN recognizes about the same number, although slightly different cases as the CIA fact book. But the answer is about just under 300. So if you do the math there, you can see that most of the world's population is bi or multilingual. Most of the world's nations and communities are bi and multilingual functionally. So this should make us curious as to how that works both within the individual brain and how communities and cultures maintain the use and strength of multiple languages within one community. So first we should ask ourselves, what does it mean to be bi or multilingual? And I use both of those fairly interchangeably here, where bilingual means knowing two languages, multilingual means knowing more than two languages. Obviously, it means the knowledge of more than one language, but what kind of knowledge or skills do you need to have? And again, take a moment, pause if you need to think about what you think is involved in being bi or multilingual. And if you yourself use more than one language, think about what the skills are that you have. As I said, take a moment to do that, and then here are some examples. So first is the idea of understanding, that you need to understand both of the or all of the languages that you know. And this includes the idea of what we call passive or receptive bilingualism, where you may speak and understand one language fluently and understand another language fairly fluently so that people can say things to you and you know exactly what they mean. But your production skills or the person's production skills aren't as strong. They can't respond in that second or third language. Speaking is another skill that people are assumed to have, and then there's the question about on what subjects. There you might be able to talk easily and fluently about home life or about school or about religion, but not about other things. Reading and writing are often cited as skills that people have to have in order to be multilingual, but that isn't always the case for a lot of reasons. First off, reading and writing are secondary skills to language acquisition. And there are many languages around the world that are not written, and throughout most of human history, languages have not been written. So reading and writing, many people think of as secondary skills to language acquisition itself. But with that said, we all know that, for example, in the education system, to be able to function in more than one language means to be able to read and or write more than one language. We also can think about what we call domains of use in language acquisition. And those domains can include things having to do with spheres of activities which happen at particular times or in particular places or with particular people. So for example, family would be a domain of use, or friendship might be a domain of use. Religion, employment, education, all of those are domains of use. And some people might use one language in one domain of use and another language in another domain of use, and therefore be more comfortable with the vocabulary, grammar, formality, social rules associated with that domain in one language, but not in their other language. We can also think about the inner functions of language. And so for some people, certain mental functions are easier in one of their languages than another. For example, counting, praying, cursing, dreaming, writing their diary, talking to themselves, talking to children. So some of those inner functions of language as well can be language dependent, or might be one way of assessing the range of bilingualism in a given individual speaker. And then finally, there's this competence that we don't often think of, and one that monolingual speakers don't really typically have, which is, when do I use which of my languages, and how do I know when to switch between my two languages? Another similar competence is the mixing of both of those languages, which we'll talk about later, which is something that almost all bilingual communities have some of going on among their speakers. So how would a given individual acquire their multiple languages? Well, there's several routes. You can acquire more than one language simultaneously, or you can acquire one language and then follow that sequentially by the acquisition of other languages. Typically in childhood, when children become bilingual or multilingual, there's a couple of ways that can happen. Within their home, it could be the case that one parent speaks to them in one language and another parent speaks to them in another language, and maybe they acquire a third language in their social interactions outside of the home. So some iterations of that might be that both of the parents speak the same non-dominant language and they're acquiring the dominant language outside of the home. It might be that the parents speak two different non-dominant languages that the child is learning, along with a third dominant language outside the home, again, or from older siblings who speak the dominant language, which happens quite a lot. It could be that one parent speaks the dominant language and one parent speaks the non-dominant language, and they each use those languages with the child. And all of these are ways that children grow up around the world regularly and have for generations speaking multiple languages. It could be that the parents are themselves bilingual in both or all of the languages that the child is acquiring. And then sometimes that domain use comes into effect, where kids are learning one language in particular environments. So they learn one language at home with their parents, but simultaneously learn another language with their grandparents, with whom they spend a lot of time, or in school or at church or something like that. So there's lots of ways that from early on in life, kids might go about acquiring multiple languages at once. It's worth knowing that the developmental sequence for multilingual children is exactly the same as that for monolinguals, and that generally what can happen is that there may be some small delays as those kids are acquiring both of their languages, but those eventually sort of come out in the wash, such that by about the age of 7 or so, multilingual children are on a par with monolingual children, except that they speak more than one language. Multilingual children do something that we call code switching, which is to move between their multiple languages in an organized way. And code switching is not evidence, and I'll say this again a couple times, of a lack of knowledge of either of the languages. It does not indicate a lack of competence. It in fact often indicates tremendous competence in both of the languages that are being used. So there have been some interesting studies about small children and code switching, which suggest that, for example, children as young as 2 years old can code switch, using their languages in contextually very sensitive sorts of ways. So one child who was studied was able to switch between Spanish and English and to make appropriate choices about whom to address in each of his languages by the age of 3. He also used his two languages for pragmatic effect by, for example, if he was telling a story and wanted to make an emphasis on something, code switching into the other language. He quoted people in the languages which they spoke. And also could use language to exclude people whom he didn't want to hear something that he was saying or understand something that he was saying. Another child code switched in speaking to his toys. But interestingly, when playing with other children, would speak to those children's toys in the language that that child used. So there's some tremendous ability to code switch very, very early on for children who are multilingual. One of the things that affects language acquisition for everyone, but this shows up particularly in multilingual acquisition early on, is what we call the affective filter, which is to say the attitudes that children are exposed to about the languages that they're acquiring. So if, for example, there are very strong negative social attitudes towards one or more of their languages, if their parents are unsure about whether it's okay to teach them the home language, if teachers are telling them that one of their languages is somehow unacceptable, all of those things create a negative affective filter that can have a significant impact on the acquisition of that language for that child. So what about the speech community, right? So it's one thing to be multilingual by oneself, but you can see children are already acquiring those languages within a community context. So how does that work? And the broader social context within which bilingualism exists can promote either the maintenance of both or all of those languages, or can pressure communities towards shift from their home language to the dominant social language. So in the cases of maintenance, societies which maintain multilingualism tend to maintain it through a process which we call diglossia, meaning that the bilingualism of individuals is widespread, so lots and lots of people are bilingual, and it's buttressed by the institution. And what that tends to mean is that there are two or more languages, and the terms that are used are high and low, neither of which is meant to mean that one is better than the other. But one language is used, for example, in education, in the news media, for example, by the government, and by maybe religion, while the other language is used in the home, in things like novels or more casual print media or television, like reality shows and things like that. That would be in that language. But everybody has to know both of those languages in order to access all of those institutions. So those domains of use then become language specific. And what that then does is it promotes the maintenance of all of those languages. However, in the context of a society with one dominant language, for example, here in the United States, language shift in given individuals and families is really typical. So historically in the US, it took about 3 generations for a family to shift from a non-dominant language to English. So for example, somebody would come to the United States speaking a non-English language in young adulthood maybe, or adulthood. Their children would grow up bilingual in that language and in English, and their grandchildren would grow up monolingual English speakers with maybe a small amount of knowledge of the non-dominant language. So many of you may actually have that in your family history, and you can think about that and ask your relatives. That's been speeding up in the last 50 or so years, such that we now see a shift happening in 2 or 2.5 generations. So somebody will come over to the United States, maybe even with children, and those children become English dominant speakers, and their younger siblings become English only speakers. And this has been has some interesting social impacts, where, for example, the younger children of parents can't easily speak to their parents because they don't fluently share the same languages, and they definitely can't speak to their grandparents. And this really disrupts social ties that are available to support children in all kinds of ways. So that's something to think about in terms of when we talk about bilingual education, why we might want to consider promoting the maintenance of home languages. And there are other reasons too, but that's one. So there have been some shifts in attitudes towards bilingualism and cognition or intelligence in the United States. Historically, there were a number of people who believed and therefore gathered data which, quote unquote, showed that bilinguals were just less cognitively capable than monolingual English speakers. And there were many, many flaws in those tests. And if you have questions about those, you can put those on the forum if you want, and we can talk more about that. But more recent and better designed studies have found that bilinguals score significantly better on tests of numerical ability, verbal and perceptual flexibility, and general reasoning, and that those who are bilingual before the age of 4, that is, who grow up with strong support for maintaining both a home language and their dominant language, show even stronger results. We'll talk about some of the impacts, though, of trying to learn a dominant language too soon in school in the next video. Bilinguals often have stronger divergent reasoning skills. That means coming up with multiple solutions to a problem rather than the solution, and have greater metalinguistic skills, meaning that they're better at noticing how their language works and how it gets things done. So some takeaways from this short video. First, most of the world's population is multilingual. So we tend in the United States to think of monolingualism as the norm because that is the prototype of speakers here in the US, although I would argue that there are many, many multilingual speakers. We just don't tend to notice it as much. But that is not normative within the world at large. In the US, language turnover is faster than ever before. And this is also important to note because there's a very strong myth in the US that immigrants hold on to their languages generation after generation and refuse to learn English. And the evidence is that that is not, in fact, the case. Finally, code switching and other forms of bilingual language use don't indicate incompetence in the languages or a lack of knowledge. And in fact, code switching often shows a tremendous versatility and ability to use both languages in order to get social work done with other people who also use both languages. So all of this is meant to be background for the bilingual education video, which is next. But in the meantime, if you have questions or thoughts or experiences of your own in bilingualism, please feel free to share them on the forum and we can start a discussion thread about this.